Dr. Kinsey, who had a PhD from Harvard in zoology, but nonetheless, well, you have this Harvard-trained PhD who's presented this data, this hundreds of pages of data showing that everything up to then that the culture believed about sexuality was wrong. And they said, well, Judith, children are sexual from birth. And it was likely that she, literally almost seduced this boy. It's not a big deal because children, and obviously Judith's jaw dropped. What do you mean children are sexual from birth? What in the world? And that's one of the reasons Judith was successful in challenging this, is that she would just show up with his book with the tables and say, okay, explain this.
You want to tell me, where are those tables?
Show 'em, right?
Where are the tables?
And these tables lay out again in scientific data form the ages of young, he would always say young males, what he deemed orgasms during a course of time. She was even, threatened.
So Mary McAlister, you're very welcome onto our podcast. I know you work with the Child and Parental Rights Organization. Could you tell us a little bit about that to start with?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me on. I work for the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, which is a nonprofit public interest law firm here in the United States. And we were founded in 2019 to represent parents in protecting their rights and protecting children, and now also we're protecting, obviously, women and children in their private spaces against the threat posed by the gender ideology agenda that has come about. So we have a very specific mission of protecting parents against secret school transitions, against all of the things that the ways they are trying to subjugate their parental role and to take over their children's development and bring about this indoctrination. So we work specifically on cases and advocacy for that.
Am I right in thinking, did Bernadette Broyles, did she establish it?
Yes, Bernadette founded the firm 2019. I came on board pretty much immediately because I have a litigation background. I helped her, we developed the litigation practice and then brought in other attorneys since then and other staff to do the various policy and advocacy work.
I remember she gave a presentation in our conference in Denver. She was brilliant, really, really charismatic, great speaker, really, really good.
Yes.
Is it mostly legal representation for parents with secret transition in schools? And for those who don't know, a lot of the time in America, there's some harrowing stories. Jeff Younger is a particularly harrowing story, but there's loads of them. I shouldn't pick him out. There are so many. That the school secretly transitioned the child without the parents' knowledge.
That has been a big focus of our practice. We have several of those cases in various courts in the country. Also, we're now working on the idea of protecting women's sports. We're representing players and coaches who've stood up for women in sports and not being ousted by males, pretending to be females.
I know.
So we're in that space. And also an emerging area we're working in is where Child Protective Services comes in. They're being weaponized to come in and take children away from parents if the parents don't agree to affirm them as this other gender. So we've had a few cases like that. And then also we just work with other attorneys. We work with legislators on passing laws. We've worked with some of the attorney generals when they have been trying to uphold their laws against the surgeries for the children. I think it's 26 states now have passed laws against doing the interventions on the children, the blockers and the hormones and the surgeries. And of course, they immediately got sued by all of the, ACLU, et cetera. And we've helped some of the attorney generals in those cases to provide expertise on upholding those laws, which, of course, now the Supreme Court of the United States has upheld them.
And may I ask, is it getting easier or is it getting harder these days?
It's becoming easier. The change in our administration, our presidential administration, of course, has greatly helped, because the Department of Justice now, which was more of an adversary, is now more of an ally, and is agreeing with us on the parents' rights and on the interventions. And so they are coming alongside us in a lot of the cases now, or at least they're not coming in against. With the prior administration, we would run into the Department of Justice would come in on the other side and try to convince, and sometimes pretty much did convince the courts, oh, you need to strike down these laws. Well, when you have the Department of Justice coming into court to say that, that has some weight. Now we have the Department of Justice coming in and saying, no, you need to uphold this law. So that's quite a change. That's been an assistance as well.
Wow. I know that you worked alongside Judith Reisman. And
yes.
I have noticed, I suppose I heard of Alfred Kinsey for decades, but never really, I'm not American, never really had a massive amount of interest in him. But yeah, he's often considered, the birthplace of the sexual revolution, for want of a better phrase. We had a very interesting podcast recently where somebody was saying, there's been, progressive liberalism really since the 60s, and really the trans movement is the culmination of it, which is quite interesting. I would have considered myself liberal and progressive, but they've become such dirty words at this stage. They've become such off-the-wall words. And anyway, yes. I've realised over the years, liberal in America is a very different word than liberal in Ireland. It's a very different connotation. So these words suddenly carry an awful lot of weight. And so Judith Reisman, could you tell us a little bit about your colleague Judith, who has passed away, but she's a fascinating figure. And I'd like you to tell us about the central tragedy that made her follow Alfred Kinsey's work for her life.
Yes. Like many of us, we get into this work because we're mothers or, grandmothers and our children, of course, protecting our children. That's what did with her. She was living in, I believe she was living in the Cleveland area. Anyway, she was living in an apartment building. Her 10-year-old daughter reported to her that she had been raped by the boy upstairs, 13-year-old boy. And he eventually was sent away, sent over to Europe or someplace anyway. But anyway, so obviously Judith was devastated.
I think the family skipped. I think they left.
Yes.
To avoid
they left. Right. They left. So anyway, but this 13-year-old boy had raped her daughter. And so Judith was by that time, she was a single mom with 4 daughters. And so she called some of her aunts who were, well-educated and all of this, and who she relied on. And she said, what in the world happened to my daughter? And they said, well, Judith, children are sexual from birth. And it was likely that she, literally almost seduced this boy, or, it's not a big deal because children, and her, obviously Judith's jaw dropped. What do you mean children are sexual from birth? What in the world? And so that started her odyssey, because then she started doing research, and eventually she did get her PhD at Case Western Reserve University. But it started her odyssey is, where does this come from that children are sexual from birth? And I think she did talk to some of her aunts and mentors about where they learned that. And so that's when she learned about Alfred Kinsey, that was the birthplace. His work was the birthplace of this idea of the sexual revolution, that, sex should be between all ages, all sexes, whatever anybody wants to do without restriction.
And what happened tragically was some years later, like the daughter went into a depression for many years and then had an aneurysm and died in her late 20s. Is that right?
That's correct. She did. Judith and her daughters moved to Israel for a period of time, largely because she had begun challenging some of the pornography industry and some of these people doing this stuff, and had some, threats. So they decided to go to Israel and for a number of years. And the oldest daughter was there. She did get married. She did have a child, but then in her early 20s, yes, she had an aneurysm basically and died in Israel in, like you say, early 20s, I believe.
Or mid-20s. I just checked. I think that the girl was 13.
Was she 13?
Yeah,
and,
it doesn't
okay,
matter. The point was she was raped, and what happened was it was a tragedy in Judith's life. And like for a lot of parents, and I think a lot of parents who are listening will understand, when there has been a great harm perpetrated on your child, everything changes. Everything changes. And Reisman's life changed. She pivoted. She thought, what the hell is going on? And am I right in thinking this boy later said that he had come across pornography in his father's press or something, and he was arguably influenced by it? Now, we're not saying, just to clarify, we're not saying pornography leads boys to run out and rape people willy-nilly all the time. However, it was completely normalized. Pornography was normalized by Alfred Kinsey, and that's what she followed, as in, what's going on here?
Yes, that's right.
So could you tell me what was, because I know you worked with Reisman, so tell me what were the issues she took with Kinsey's work? If somebody was to learn a little bit about Kinsey, what is the issue? What are the main kind of headlines around Kinsey's work?
Well, the idea that he was known as the father of the sexual revolution, of course, that revolved around his two books that he published. The first one in 1948 was Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And that was really the one that sort of exploded onto the world. And then 1953, he did Sexual Behavior in the Human Female,
which was over 800 pages.
Yeah, and both of them were, very deep. And they were presented, of course, by the media. And like today, there was a media firestorm. Everything had been planned out. There were the people who wanted this message out there, who made sure it was in the media everywhere you went. It was presented as these are 600, 800-page books filled with charts and graphs and data. So it was presented as scientific, and this is in the 40s and 50s when science was really revered as well. If you have scientific basis for something, then it's something that you must pay attention to. And Dr. Kinsey, who had a PhD from Harvard in zoology, but nonetheless he was okay. Well, you have this Harvard trained PhD who's presented this data, this hundreds of pages of data showing that everything up to then that the culture believed about sexuality was wrong, and particularly the laws and the customs of restraint sexually, that you engage in sexual acts with your husband or wife exclusively. You don't just engage in acts at any time or place with any other person. And that was the healthy and the best way of going with sexual behavior. That was accepted, obviously, that was what one should do. And children were raised that way, and parents, obviously you always had people who were committing adultery or things like that. I mean, you have that, but that wasn't the norm, and that wasn't recognized as being the optimal norm for society. And so now you have this 600-page book was full of data and charts saying that's all wrong, folks. You know, science tells us that any manner of sexual activity, any type of activity you want to engage in with either sex, with children, with any person is perfectly fine. It's not going to be harmful. It's freeing. You can be yourself. You can express yourself sexually in any way you want to, and you're going to have a great life if you do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the 60s, then free love came about, and it's
Yes.
There has been with the contraceptive pill, there has been an extraordinary change in the sexual behavior of humans since then. There's no doubt about it. Like that, like we were primarily monogamous. The contraceptive pill being a massive changer, but Kinsey came just before it, and it feels like two things happened at the very similar time, and bang, there's been a huge change in our sexual behavior. And I know that he presented it very much as scientific data in a very dry way. However, his own behavior was pretty degenerate. And so his sample was skewed. So even though there was over 5,000 men, for example, in this book, would you tell us where he got his samples of 5,000 men? What was the time period? Was this between 1936 and 1950s that he was collecting this information, or 1940s?
Yeah, I believe it was 1938, 39 through about 43, 42, 43, because he had to then assemble the work and put it into the book, which was published in the first part of 1948.
Yeah.
And of course, they didn't have, obviously, the computers and, all of that. So a lot of, it was just calculations and writing all that. But yeah, he claimed to have had that. Of course, this was the time when many men were called off to war. If you were pretty much, if you were able-bodied and you were 18 to, 30 or so, you were drafted and, sent off to war. So most of the people he talked to, many of them were prisoners. Because they weren't drafted, and
18% were prisoners. I looked it up.
Yes.
18%.
Yes. Yeah. And many of those prisoners were, sexual offenders at that time. Also, then he would go to, places where
gay bars, gay bars, saunas, bathhouses, places like that.
Right.
To invite them. Is that what he would do?
Oh, yes. He would go to these places, and he would talk to them, want to interview them about their sexual practices and, all these details. He would present himself as a scientist, as I'm a scientist. I'm studying this. Obviously, these people at that time, people who were engaging in those activities would probably be reluctant to talk to someone because they were largely illegal and obviously frowned upon. But here was someone who came, I'm a scientist, I'm going to be objective and neutral, and I really do want to find out what you do, how what kind of sexual activity you engage in, how often, and all of these things, and then present this into my book. And so people would feel comfortable talking to him. And he himself would engage in many of those activities with other men. Maybe not when he was in the room, maybe he would.
Yeah, as far as I can see, he kind of skewed the numbers, as in probably because of the men he was meeting, he ended up like kind of basically presenting the idea that 10% of men were gay. And the other research doesn't replicate that. So it's more of this was a reflection of who he was asking into the studies, but it went into the knowledge stream.
Correct. That's right. It really did reflect that it was presented as these were the average American men at the time.
Yeah. And it's interesting for people who might be wondering why I first became interested in Kinsey. I had a vague interest, but nothing really very much, was when I realized that when you look for the accounts of the first transgender child, the first child who was intervened. It was in 1948, Alfred Kinsey introduced a child to Harry Benjamin. And that child was subsequently given medical interventions. And we don't know what became of that child. We don't know what happened after that. But it was Alfred Kinsey and Harry Benjamin, neither, frankly, characters that have history has viewed very well. But it's an extraordinary what was happening in those times, that there was this kind of very experimental attitude towards sex, and it opened up all sorts of doors. And I suppose the most shocking for most people, I think, was the really strange tables in Alfred Kinsey's books. And our producer is going to put up some graphs there, but you can tell us a little bit about the information around. Kinsey's point was, we're all sexual beings. We're having way more sex than anybody else is saying that we are. We're there's all sorts of extraordinary sexual behavior happening behind closed doors that nobody's talking about. Now, there was probably lots of truths in some of what he said. There was no doubt about it, because he kind of said how often people were having sex, in marriages and stuff like that. And I think this was such extraordinary information for people, because people didn't know it before. Like, it was never spoken about. So you could say like half of it could have been very informative and very interesting, and then the other half was incredibly inappropriate and disturbing and criminal. So could you tell us about the children, which is just, as far as I can see, just completely criminal and frankly ruins the rest of his research?
Yes, well, in fact, he devoted an entire chapter of his male book on childhood sexuality, chapter 5. And he presented then, I don't think the exact words are in the book, but certainly his colleagues, and he said later on that we have proven through our research, and I'll put air quotes around research, that children are sexual from birth and are not harmed by sexual activity at any time. The only real harm that comes to children having sex with adults or anyone else at any time in their lives is from the adults freaking out about it, basically, and stressing about it. And that is what harms the child. And so what he presented in his book as his proof, so to speak, of this are a series of tables in the book, tables 30 through 34 in chapter 5 of his book. And I'm being very specific because a lot of people may not believe this, but they can go to a library, get his male book out, and open it to chapter 5, and you will see the tables there. And that's one of the reasons Judith was successful in challenging this, is that she would just show up with his book with the tables and say, okay, explain this. And these tables lay out again in dry scientific data form, the ages of young, he would always say young males, and what he deemed orgasms they would have in how many times, how during a course of time. And the ages go, one table had like a 2-month-old, but the one that stands out is in table 34, you had a 5-month-old who supposedly had 3 orgasms in a certain amount of time. And probably most shocking, that Judith often would bring this one out, and she would have the tables blown up on a big poster board or whatever in a presentation, and have this highlighted. Is a 4-year-old supposedly had a certain number of orgasms in a 24-hour period,
26,
like she would say.
26 orgasms in a 24-hour period.
In a 24-hour period. And so like Judith would point out, so somebody was with this 4-year-old child, a person or persons was with this child for 24 hours around the clock, quote unquote, observing this child having orgasms. And what did he call orgasms? It was, the children were in pain. For anybody who would who would really objectively look at it. But, they were pulling away from the person who was touching them, screaming, writhing, and that was regarded as they were engaging in sexual pleasure. That's according to Kinsey. And again, it was very dry language. It was all matter of fact. He would say, well, they had a partner, a sexual partner, a 5-month-old and a 4-year-old.
And a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old. Yeah. This is dreadful child abuse.
Right. I mean, it was adult, maybe men, maybe women, maybe both, but adults molesting infants and children and recording it. And that was one of the things he had talked about, that he thought was that, well, they used professionals and they recorded their work, and they used stopwatches, and they wrote everything down, because they were scientists, like he was. And so they were doing all this. And they all said that, and with just a straight face and no presumption that was in any way out of the ordinary. They were doing a scientific experiment. They were, and in there, it was in the table. And if you would look at, and so that would be the thing, that thousands of people supposedly read these books and looked at them and studied them and relied on them. And how do you look at those charts and not understand what that meant? It was, their consciences were seared, or they were blinded somehow, or whatever. But that's in the book to this day. When you look at that with an objective worldview, you see that this is the record of criminal sexual abuse of children.
Yes.
And it's presented to the audience as scientific experimentation that proved that children are sexual from birth and shouldn't be denied sexual activity at any time.
How did it get through? How did people not just suddenly say, this is disgraceful, Chapter 5 makes this book a criminal book and he should be charged?
I think it's a lot of, unfortunately, we see the same thing today, is the people who are participating in it, this is a scientific experiment. This is science. This is something that needs to be told to people. It's factual. Just a searing of any conscience, because I know Judith herself asked someone who was a proponent of Kinsey's work, and she showed him the table, and she said, "You read this? You didn't?" And he said, I didn't see it. I just didn't see it."
Wow, that's so familiar.
So and so, and of course, he had the backing of a lot of the elites, elite organizations, funders, foundations that are still familiar today, that were funding all of this and were pushing it out to the public. And so again, you had the aspect of just greed of I can make a lot of money publishing these books, or doing these courses or what have you. And then, of course, it got ingrained in people. And then, of course, you had right after that, you had Hugh Hefner launching Playboy. And
tell us about the connection between Hugh Hefner and Alfred Kinsey, if you could.
Hugh Hefner was, Judith loved this story, but Hugh Hefner was a typical college male in the 1940s, a sexual virgin, just living his life the way his parents had showed him. And he was in college, and he read Kinsey's book, and it was like his aha moment from his standpoint. And he said, I've been lied to. We've been lied to all these years. Everyone out there is engaging in sexual activity and having a great time and not being harmed by it. And we're being told we have to restrain our desires and all of this. Then did his thesis for college on Kinsey, on the book. And he proclaimed that he would become Kinsey's pamphleteer.
Wow.
Which, of course, he did. Founded Playboy shortly after the book was published.
Well, we all know what happened with Hugh Hefner and Playboy, and it very much normalized pornography into society each decade, more so. The finally in the 1980s, pornography was freely available in every TV screen in the hotels in America. So they knew how to normalize it. Now anybody who's followed the subjects we're interested in has seen other extraordinary, like trans kids being normalized as a concept. What can be normalized should never be underestimated. But what were Kinsey's views on porn? What was his data on porn? How did he kind of create an aha moment for Hugh Hefner?
Well, I think what happened with Hefner is that he realized that Kinsey presented, having sexual activity of any kind is normal and unharmful, and in fact beneficial to everyone, including children. And so we should all be free to engage in whatever we want to engage in. And if we take pictures of it and we show it to other people, that's just part of the freedom that we should have,
fun, as they say,
the fun. And so that's what sparked Hefner, was that, well, wait a minute, why am I sitting here in my dorm room studying and being good and well behaved and really wanting to have sex with my girlfriend, but not doing it because I'm told it's not appropriate? And how many hundreds of men are out there the same as me that would really love to be just out there having fun sexually, but are being told we can't because it's not proper? Here, this official Harvard-trained scientist is telling us it's perfectly fine and you should be out there having fun and doing whatever you want. So I'm going to be sure people know that. Wow.
And, obviously he claimed in the end probably did have sex with over 1,000 women in the end, and more probably. I know that Judith Reisman, whose daughter was originally, raped and then went into a depression and then ultimately died in her 20s. So it's a tragedy. And Judith she decided to follow Kinsey's work and expose it. What was the response by society? Because she was trying to say, hang on, have you seen what's going down here? What was the response? Did they write her off as some sort of, religious zealot, or how did society take it?
Not surprisingly, not well. She, was ostracized. She was even, threatened, especially by the pornographers. She early on took aim at pornography, and in fact, she received, when Ronald Reagan was president, she obtained a grant to study the effects of pornography, and particularly pornography in children. And it was a very large grant at the time. And that, of course, she hit all kinds of roadblocks with that. And they did everything they could to discredit her research. And to say it wasn't worth anything, etc. And she had her PhD at the time, and she obviously was running the research in a scientifically appropriate way.
Yeah.
And she was affiliated with American University at the time, and that was how the grant was being funneled. And she had collected the data. I mean, she hired the equivalent of coders today, but people who would sit and look at the content of the various pornographic magazines and record very specific statistics of when a child would be portrayed and how, or when, all of these different things. So she had, a stack of, and this was, of course, pre-computer days. So it was, handwritten statistics that showed the prevalence of children in these magazines. And so she was getting ready to and of course, hitting roadblocks. They were sabotaging the research. They were, they would have people come to work for her that would lose things, that would, destroy things like that. But she was.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that last sentence? You said she had people coming to work that would lose things and destroy things.
She would, the university, she would hire somebody from the university to say, do secretarial work or administrative work, and the documentation would be missing.
Sabotaged.
That was sabotaged. Yeah.
Wow.
And but she persisted, and she had pretty much finished the statistical analysis and had it ready to go. And they were and she went to Congress. Of course, those in Congress who did not appreciate it would call her in all the time and would be doing investigations as to whether she was properly using the grant money, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
So she'd go in and testify and do all that. And she always came out that, it was fine. But nonetheless, they persisted. And so they imposed on American University, you got to shut this down. Because she was finding stuff that was going to make a lot of very powerful people very uncomfortable, as we continue to see today with different things. And so they were, the pressure was on. You need to shut this down. You need to discredit this research. You need to say that she's a nutcase that doesn't know what she's doing. So, and this is another interesting aside that I'll try not to spend too much time on, but they basically had given her the ultimatum. They say, you must turn in all of your originals, all of your work to us by such and such a date. And then we're going to make an announcement and we're going to shut it down. Oh. So Dr. Jerry Falwell, the original, the founder of Liberty University, who passed in 2007, I believe. Anyway, he had gotten word of her research, and he took it upon himself he brought her to Lynchburg, Virginia, and he put his staff on 24-hour time to copy everything that she had, to make copies of all of her research and to maintain then a complete original copy of it. And then she showed up, and she had this deadline. And basically, if she didn't show up with her research by this deadline, they were going to just say she failed, she misused the money, she didn't get us some material in time. Well, he helped facilitate that she did show up where she needed to show up with her materials, and including he flew up there in his jet and that kind of thing.
Falwell.
Just Judith and Falwell did. Mm-hmm. So. But still, what they did then is, so here's my materials as promised, as required. And so they were then supposed to review it and then announce the results. Well, it was maybe 24 hours later, there came out an announcement that it was not good research. It had not proven anything. And, they shut it down. And what she sent to them, I'm sure, has long since been destroyed. Wow. But she maintained this one original set and still has it, still in her archive. She was tried to publicly discredit her with that. And that was an example of, throughout her career, the powerful elites would do what they can. And of course, that was around the time too, that, like I had mentioned earlier, that I think it was Larry Flint. It was one of the big pornography guys. It wasn't Hefner, but it was one of the big pornography guys. Put out basically sort of death threats to her and to her kids, and another colleague of hers who was on her side, whose daughter was actually, I believe, attacked. And that was the time when Judith decided that she and her daughters needed to go to Israel.
Wow.
Because they were of Jewish descent. So, if you're of Jewish descent, you may immigrate to Israel.
Yeah.
So she went there and taught in an Israeli university for a period of time, and did continue to do some of her work over there. And then, of course, eventually she did, after her oldest daughter died, she and the other girls came back to the United States.
How did you know Reisman? How did you know her and come to work with her?
I first came to know of her because I picked up her book, Sexual Sabotage, and began reading it because I was deeply interested in. I was working for the law firm Liberty Counsel at the time, which is a civil rights. They do religious liberty and sexual revolution, against the sexual revolution, that kind of thing. And I was very interested in the idea of the sex trafficking and the children and protecting children. And so I picked up her book, Sexual Sabotage, and began reading it. And it was just like, light went off in my head.
Really?
Wow. This is it.
Sexual Sabotage, how one mad scientist unleashed a plague of corruption and contagion on America. Whoa.
Right. I had read that. And it's funny because my copy of it is here, and I've got all these, marks and everything in it. And so anyway, I was working there, and we had an office at Liberty University because my boss at the time was helping run the law school at Liberty University. And so she had been invited by my boss, who was a good champion of her, my former boss, and was bringing her to the university for a lecture. And he did eventually bring her on as a lecturer at the law school. And so Judith Reisman's going to speak about, I think it was probably about same-sex marriage and the homosexual issues at that time. And I said, hey, I would really like to go to that lecture. And so I did, and she was there, and I had brought my book with me because it was,
And is it my mistake? Is it Reisman, not Reisman? I've been pronouncing it wrong.
It's either one. I think she said Reisman, but she never cared either way.
Yeah.
So I was sitting there in one of the law school classrooms, and she said something, and then somebody else was talking, and then somebody said something about something that was in her book. So I picked up my copy of the book, and I'm, oh, wait a minute, like this. And she looked back at me, and she saw my book with all my,
and she fell in love with you.
All my flags. And we clicked at that point. I mean, and my boss had asked her to do a white paper. So she, wanted me to help her with it. And he said that was fine. And so from that point on, we worked together quite a bit while we worked in Liberty Counsel.
Could I find out now, was she against homosexuality, and did she advocate against homosexuality?
Well, she felt that it was it was not a healthy, obviously a good lifestyle, a healthy sexual act to engage in. And for all of the things that have come out about AIDS and HIV and everything since then. So she did feel that it was not something that people should engage in,
and did she advocate and campaign against it? So was she well known for being anti-gay rights?
I think she was probably known for that. Her focus was much more on the children and not sexualizing children. But she certainly didn't believe that homosexuality shouldn't be championed, and that she did not believe it was appropriate. I mean, she wasn't going to, obviously you don't condemn people for the things they engage in, but she thought the behavior was not good and should not be championed or, decriminalized or whatever was going on in terms of
and so
society.
I'm very well aware lots of people would disagree on that, but I'm hoping that people will have the ability to agree on one thing and disagree on another thing, and be very offended by one thing but be very interested by another thing, just like we did in the 20th century. This idea that we could, have an understanding that different people take different. Was it a religious ethos that was mostly characterizing her work, do you think? Or was it a response to what had happened to her daughter? Or did they converge?
I think it was a combination. I mean, certainly what happened to her daughter was the impetus for what prompted her to do this work and to keep with it, even after all that she went through. She grew up, Jewish. Her, background was Jewish. Her parents were, I think they were actually called themselves communists. They were quite, progressive. I mean, quite on the left side of that. And I don't know that they, went to synagogue regularly or anything, but she grew up Jewish. But then as she worked on these issues, so there was always that background that this is not what God ordains as appropriate. It's a sinful act, especially with children, that God expects us to protect children and not have children harmed by these things.
I'm just looking at the list of her books, which says a lot, like, of where her work went. So in 1990, she released Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, The Indoctrination of the People. Then in 91, she released Soft Porn Plays Hardball, Its Tragic Effects on Women, Children and the Family. And she went back to Kinsey in 1998 with Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, The Red Queen and the Grand Scheme. And then another Kinsey book in 2006, Kinsey's Attic, the shocking story of how one man's sexual pathology changed the world. Then 2010, your book, Sexual Sabotage, How One Mad Scientist Unleashed a Plague of Corruption and Contagion on America. So Kinsey was clearly her focus rather than, I just want this to be very clear if anybody gets very, distracted by religion or distracted by her views on homosexuality. Well, we're not trying to, pull the wool over anybody's eyes. This was a woman who followed Kinsey, and Kinsey actually created a good deal of good work and very bad work. One could argue that there was the impact of Kinsey's work is really pretty mind-blowing. Could you tell us about, she was on Donahue. Could you tell us that?
Yes.
We're going to, show the clip of Donahue.
You've got 2 months old,
5 months
okay? You've got one child allegedly having a climax. Where are those tables? So you've got 24 hours around the clock, 26 orgasms in a 4-year-old. You want to tell me, where are those tables?
Show them, Brian.
Where are the tables?
Yeah. Well, we're going to show them.
There.
Now,
All right, read
now, what is the point?
You
what is
tell
your
me
point?
what is the point. 5 months old, number of orgasms, 3. Go down to the 4-year-old. You see the 4-year-old there?
17, yeah.
There, bottom one.
Yes,
4-year-old, 26 orgasms in 24 hours. Tell me, Phil, does a baby sleep? Tell me if this is scientific. A baby sleeps for 8 hours?
And
you tell me how you get 26 orgasms for 24
well,
hours.
I don't know about that.
We've got to be able to get a word in edgewise.
Well,
Just a minute.
Sounds like a guest for the Donahue show.
And you know what Gebhard said to me? You know what Dr. Gebhard
What'd he say?
He wrote me a letter, which I wish you had up there too, in which he said that oral and manual techniques were used on the children. Now, Phil, I'm going to say that once more. I'm going to say that once more. And if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
Yeah,
what American is going to defend?
Yes, that was all of us who knew her just, knew that was pure Judith. She got onto the Donahue show quite by accident.
For those who are younger might know, these were talk shows that happened in America. Right. And they were wild. As a kid in Ireland, they were wild. Yes. And anything was discussed.
Yeah, he was early. He was an early
talk show
version he was an early version of the talk show. They got even wilder after his. But yeah, he would have guests on about controversial subjects and try to get them, going after each other and that kind of thing. So anyway, she was brought onto the show, I think, quite by accident, by mistake. I believe her producers didn't know who she really, but by providence, she ended up being a guest on his show with a number of other people on there. Most of them were advocates or proponents of Dr. Kinsey's work. One of them was his photographer, one of his photographers who worked with him. And I believe there was another one or two people who knew him, or either knew him, worked with him, or they obviously were a proponent of his work. And then there was Judith. And so they got to talking about Kinsey and his effect on the country, and how, from Donahue's perspective, how wonderful it was. And he was the father of the sexual revolution, and he made a difference in all of our lives and freed us from sexual repression and, all of these things. So Judith started talking about, and Judith had brought the tables and given them to his producer.
The tables that we put up earlier, the tables with all the kind of child abuse, scientific child abuse.
So she started talking about that. Well, Kinsey was a big fraud, and his research was faulty. His research used pedophiles, sexual offenders.
He also worked. We forgot to mention he worked with a Nazi pedophile for many years, Fritz von Ballosack. This guy couldn't have discredited himself in any ways further than he did. He really did everything. Nazi pedophiles is pretty as bad as it gets.
Yeah. Oh, of course, and nobody knew that until much later. But yes, he did. Yeah, and another American serial pedophile. But so she started, speaking about Kinsey and sort of, slicing away at his reputation, and saying that, he engaged, he facilitated sexual abuse of children. He, all of these different things, that his work was sketchy, if not fraudulent, etc. And Donahue was just furious. And,
how did that go down, at the aftermath of Donahue? What was the audience like, or what happened afterwards?
Well, yeah, she kept pushing him, as you see, she kept pushing him to put the tables up, because he went to Kinsey's photographer and said, well, Dr. Kinsey didn't interview pedophiles, did he? And he said, oh yeah, he did. Well, certainly they were in jail for their crimes. Well, some weren't. Yeah, just a matter of fact.
Oh my gosh.
And so Donahue was so Judith kept, as you see, Judith kept pushing. Phil, put the table up. Put the table up. Put the table up.
The table is horrifying. It's horrifying.
So then, put the table up, and there was, pretty much silence. And I think you could hear, probably some gasping or whatever, and we don't know how much was cut out of what they broadcast. But of course, Donahue didn't have a whole lot to say about Dr. Kinsey after that.
Wow. And now today, could you tell me, just as we're finishing up, what was the impact of Kinsey in schools? What was the impact of sex education in Kinsey? And we have a couple of questions from, people who watch Beyond Gender a little bit around the schools. So first of all, tell us, what is the impact of Kinsey in schools?
Just monumental. Once the books came out and they gained credibility in terms of those who run education and things like that. And of course, the criminal laws in America were changed in accordance with that. Things were decriminalized or lessened the punishments were lessened for them. Then the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, Planned Parenthood, formed what's called SECUS, which is the Sexual Education Information Network of the United States. Anyway, okay. So that was founded by the Kinsey Institute and by Planned Parenthood. A Planned Parenthood former director became head of it. It became the go-to organization to develop sex education materials in the United States. It worked on training teachers in sex education. Sex education became very graphic, became very, everything was normalized, as we're seeing now. Explicit discussions with children, because children are sexual from birth and they're going to be engaging in these things. They need to know about it. That's the attitude.
But surely
See,
that
very
happened
graphic.
slowly, because I suppose I'm Irish. I didn't get any sex education, but I don't know, really what's happened in different countries.
Yeah, I'd have to think it was probably the 60s. I know early on, they began sort of the experiments in it. What they did is they started with a low-income African-American schools in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Now I don't know about. I do know. Did you say something about UNESCO? My point is, I went to school in the 80s and the 90s, and I didn't get any sex education. Now this is in Ireland, but I didn't get any at all. Now different countries have different, regimes.
Right.
So, but I gathered from speaking with so many parents over the years that really sex education has only really become difficult and challenging in recent years, is my understanding. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it has been gradual, because what happened first, of course, is that they had to develop the materials that they wanted to present. They had to train the people who were going to teach it. So what they would start in would be in the colleges and the universities.
Yeah.
The training people who were studying to be teachers.
And I think from what you're saying is that Kinsey, if I'm right in thinking, Kinsey created a culture, and the culture was anything goes sexually. And with that, it might have freed some people who were bound by an awful lot of shame around their sex drive. But it also unfettered people who had really dark sex drives into really degenerate behaviour. And that is, we have seen, arguably now we see the impact of that. And specifically, we can kind of see it in his views around children are sexual from birth concept. Shows this was a man who didn't understand boundaries and who didn't understand the importance of sex in terms of health and in terms of intimacy and in terms of other aspects of society. But what I'd like to ask you, just as we're coming up towards the end, is some questions that have been sent in to us from our Substack. And one is, it's about your work in child and parental rights, and one is about schools. What defence does the school districts have for hiding social transition and gender identity issues from parents? What is the school's defence?
The school's defense is that many of the children's parents are going to not be supportive of them engaging in this change, and that would be dangerous for these children if their parents knew about it, because the parents could do something to harm the children. And therefore, the children need to have their privacy respected, and therefore the parents need to not be told, because it could be damaging and harmful to the child. And of course, under the prior administration, they had the sort of backing of the administration saying, well, yes, because we think that is discrimination against them for being transgender, so we don't want any parents told. And that was what was presented to the schools, and their attorneys would follow that and say, well, it's too harmful, potentially harmful to the children if their parents aren't 100% on board, so we can't have the parents know about this.
And that came from this idea that everything goes in sex, arguably. And then it also comes from the idea, like all sex drives are healthy sex drives, even if the child is engaging in, I don't know, relentless porn through their smartphone and on the school bus. And this is happening, because I've met these teenagers and sending, pornographic images to children that really haven't even been sexualized yet. So there's really, really creepy stuff happening. Child on child sex abuse, if you follow me, is an under-acknowledged issue. But I think the school's defense is also, they have this idea that parents can ruin their child's life because they have attitudes towards let's say if they're gay or something like that. And that's where it kind of
Yes.
sprung from. And from that, it's like any sort of parental kind of values that don't cut it in society are now kind of presumed to be damaging rather than the parent values. Because, arguably, there's a lot of things about my parents and not just their values that I might have taken issue with, but I survived it, like we all do.
Yeah.
This idea that these parents are these huge, big, kind of heavy, dark presences, I think psychology has a lot to answer for that. Another question that came up was, do the schools realize that they've placed a wedge between child and parents at a time when the teen needs parental guidance more than anything?
Yes.
They do.
But the underlying idea is that they need to be the one directing that. The school, the state needs to be the one directing that. And that, like you just said, they agree. Well, the parents are sort of the enemies to the child here, because the child is the one who should make these decisions. The child is the one who should have the privacy to do what she or he wants to do, and the parents are an improper influence. So yeah, they are driving the wedge, and they're figuring that they can then they want to be the influencer in their child's life.
I know,
Right.
we really
Not the parents.
Yeah. And another question that came in said, who is responsible for pushing this in schools?
Oh gosh. All of the captured organizations, for the better, the teachers unions, the colleges and universities that train the teachers, all of those organizations, the societal
Things like
organizations.
UNESCO or United Nations or any of them, have they any impact on any of it? No.
Yes. In terms of educational policy, developing educational policy, yes. Yeah. And in the United States, the National Education Association, the various organizations like that develop educational policy for the schools. And it was the Department of Education and, the Federal Department of Education, but that's undergoing significant change and going to probably eventually be dismantled, and it'll be the individual states that will, again, determine educational policy. But, a lot of it's money driven, obviously, too, because the federal government hands out a lot of money to the schools. And so the federal government says, hey, you get this federal money if you, not my words, not theirs, indoctrinate children with this ideology, you get these big grants and you get all this money. And so that drives it.
According to Child and Parental Rights, how will we stop this heavy influence of the state on children, on schools? This over the top impact, this overreach of power, really, schools have.
Right. Well, obviously having school choice available where parents, from the standpoint of, and some of that is happening now. There are some states who are passing this. They're basically saying to parents, look, we spend X amount of dollars per child on education. So rather than you just go into your neighborhood public school, you can receive the money from the state, and you can then place your child in a school you choose, or homeschool, or what you choose to do. So that is the thing. Some parents, obviously there are many parents who can't afford to simply put their children in religious or private schools, or stay home and homeschool them. So that is an option. And to basically regain, and we're doing trying to do some of this through the courts, but also just in the grassroots of the school boards, et cetera, is returning the parents into the driver's seat of what's done at schools, because it has shifted greatly now, and the courts unfortunately have enforced this, that you drop your kid off at a public government school, and you are ceding your authority over the child to the school, not only in reading and math and social science or whatever, but in these social issues. And you can't, and if you don't like it, pull your kid out and do something else. Well, first of all, in America, we pay a bunch of taxes to run these schools. So the idea that we pay taxes and then I can't use what we're paying taxes for. So that's how the school choice issue has come up now, is that tax money can be redirected to something that the parent chooses. And then the other thing is, over and above that is, many parents are financially just, struggling to make sure the bills are paid and food and clothing and all that, and can't, on top of paying the taxes, pay for separate schooling.
It's not feasible for most families.
It's not feasible for most. And of course, unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States has said as much now this last term, in this case that was brought against the Maryland schools by religious parents who did not want their children indoctrinated by the school board in Maryland, which is very, very progressive. Decided that all of the children needed to be exposed to LGBTQ books, storybooks, pre-K through 5th grade.
Okay.
And, religious parents objected. Eventually, the Supreme Court did now say, no, parents continue to have the right to direct their child's religious upbringing. Schools cannot usurp that. So that's a step.
Okay.
In the right direction of returning parents' rights to the parents.
So my last question, thank you so much for the work you do. I think it's really important. I think child and parental rights have really saved so many devastated families. I don't think it could be underestimated. Judith Reisman, at the end of her life, she died in her early 80s. Did she feel that she did get the word out about Kinsey? I certainly heard it, that there were issues and child issues. I think it got into public consciousness eventually. What do you think?
Yes, I think it did towards the end of her life, as the sea change was occurring and people were waking up to the fact that Kinsey was not what he presented himself to be, and people seeing the devastating consequences of what was going on. She was, beginning to see that, yes.
That was 2021 she died.
She died in 2021, right, April, right before her 86th birthday.
Okay, right. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for coming on. It was very, very interesting. Exactly what I wanted to hear about Kinsey. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, Stella. I follow your work, and I really appreciate what you're doing. And as a, Irish American, I always love to speak. I'd love to hear your Irish accent.
Oh, you're McAlister. My auntie.
Reminds me of some of my aunts that I used to, before they passed, and they would come in and they would still have the
Irish accent.
Have the Irish accent. That always just delights me.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. Okay. Thank you so much.